My beloved child, Jared, you have come to the right place right now. I see you seeking, even in the stillness of your small room, surrounded by the noise of a city that does not know your name. I sense the depths of your heart, the unspoken questions, the weary ache, and I assure you, this word, in this very moment, is for you. There is no accident that you are here, reading these lines. It is a divine appointment, a holy invitation from me to you. I invite you to listen deeply, not merely with your eyes, but with the spirit inside you that has been longing for a true home. I am about to reveal something precious, signs of hope for your journey, strength for your struggle, an intimate embrace for the heaviness you carry, and a way forward when all doors look closed. Consider, just for a breath, what it would mean to truly meet me here. Not as a distant concept, but as the living God who comes near to speak into your very life. If you turn away now, my loving voice will wait for you, but you know how easily other voices of doubt, of fear, of shame can drown out the truth. You risk staying in the patterns and pains that have shadowed your heart, when right now you are being offered a freedom designed exactly for your soul. No other word will meet you like this one, direct and tender, unwavering and gentle. It is a whisper from the one who made you, who understands both your deepest doubts and your most fragile dreams. You are seen, you are treasured, and this message is rooted in a love deeper than the oceans. Let me tell you plainly, I always arrive on time. Even now, as your spirit feels at its limits, your strength worn thin, your hope nearly faded into the city twilight, I reach out to you. I know the places where answers seem locked away and despair taunts you from the shadows of your memory. Yet here I come, right into this hour, to give you a word of hope, to offer my hand and draw you out of that despair and into the light. When you rest in me, who or what can truly stand against you? No force, seen or unseen, can conquer the heart that clings to my promises. My presence in your life is not a far-off story, but your daily reality. If you trust me, I will grant you serenity, a quiet determination to keep moving, to fight on. The silence in the room had a sound. It was a low hum, the ghost of electricity in the walls, punctuated by the maddeningly rhythmic drip of the kitchen faucet. Drip, a beat of silence. Drip. It was a relentless metronome, counting down the seconds of a life stalled in place. Jared sat motionless, letting the cold air of the small space seep into his bones. Outside, the city roared its endless, chaotic symphony, a siren's long wail cutting through a cacophony of distant traffic and muffled shouts. But in here, the only composition was one of decay. He was surrounded by paper. He didn't need to see the letters to know them. He knew them by their feel. The crisp, expensive bond of the conservatory's rejection felt mocking beneath his fingertips. The flimsy, almost translucent paper of the community orchestra's polite refusal rustled like dry leaves. He had become a connoisseur of disappointment, a collector of phrases that all meant the same thing. No, not you. But it was the newest one, the one that lived not on paper but behind the cold, hard surface of his laptop screen, that had finally broken him. He had read the words so many times they no longer seemed like letters, but like brands seared into his mind. While the applicant's submission displays a high degree of technical proficiency, the committee found the work to be emotionally hollow. The two words echoed in the vacuum of the room, louder than the city outside, more persistent than the dripping tap. Hollow, a beautiful, intricate vessel with nothing inside. All those years of study, the endless hours of practice until his fingers were stiff and his back ached, the sacrifice of friendships and family gatherings for the sake of his craft, had it all just been an exercise in mechanics? Had he trained the soul out of his music, leaving behind nothing but a perfect, lifeless skeleton? He had once believed his music was his soul, the only honest way he could communicate. He remembered the feeling years ago of a melody arriving unbidden, a feeling so pure and overwhelming it was like channeling light. He would rush to the piano, his heart pounding with a sacred urgency, and let the notes spill out. The joy of it had been his sustenance, his religion. Now that faith was gone. The silence from the piano in the corner was an accusation. It had been weeks since he'd touched it for anything other than to move it while sweeping. He ran a hand over the smooth, closed lid, his fingers coming away with a film of dust. The dust felt like a layer of fine ash, the remains of a fire long extinguished. He could feel the slight stickiness of the keys even through the wood, a memory of humidity and neglect. To play now would feel like an act of profound dishonesty. How could he create a world of sound when his own inner world had collapsed into silence? A deep, gnawing emptiness coiled in his stomach, a hunger that had nothing to do with the fact he'd skipped lunch. It was a hollowness of spirit, a void where passion used to be. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to block out the phantom glow of the screen, the phantom words, hollow, 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 hollow. He stood, his joints protesting with a faint creak. The floorboards groaned under his weight, each sound an intrusion on the room's stagnant quiet. He needed to move, to do something, anything to escape the suffocating presence of his own failure. Maybe a glass of water, the simple act of swallowing something cold and clean. As he took a step toward the kitchen, a new sound cut through the air. It was a dry, whispery slide, the sound of paper on the rough wood of the floor by the front door. He froze. His heart, which had been beating with a slow, tired rhythm, suddenly hammered against his ribs. He didn't need to see the envelope to know its color. He didn't need to read the words through the paper to know what they said. It was a sound he had been dreading for months, a sound that signaled the end of this quiet purgatory and the beginning of a much louder, more terrifying chaos. He walked toward the door, each step feeling unnaturally heavy, as if he were wading through deep water. He bent down, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the stiff, cheap paper. It felt coarse and impersonal. He picked it up. The single sheet inside was folded, but through the thin envelope he could feel the indentation of two words, pressed hard in unforgiving ink. Final notice. He didn't have to open it. He knew the terms. 1 month. 30 days before his key would no longer turn in the lock, before this small, decaying world that was his, and his alone, would be taken from him. The city, which had been a distant roar, suddenly felt like a beast scratching at the door, waiting to devour him. The drip from the faucet seemed to speed up, each drop hitting the basin with a sharp, percussive pop. Drip, 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 a frantic, panicked heartbeat. Jared walked slowly back across the room, the letter clutched in his hand. He stopped before the piano, his silent, dusty accuser. For a long moment, he stood there, feeling the weight of the instrument in the room, the weight of the years, the weight of the single piece of paper in his hand. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and straightened the lid, making sure it was perfectly aligned. He pressed down firmly. Thump. The sound was dull, heavy, and absolute. It was the sound of a coffin closing, the sound of surrender. In the ringing quiet that followed, the only thing he could hear was the city, waiting. The dull thump of the piano lid still hung in the air, a final, heavy note in a song of defeat. Jared stood frozen in the center of the room, the eviction notice a brittle wafer of ice in his hand. The paper's sharp edges pressed into his palm, a small, grounding pain in a sea of abstract despair. The finality of the sound, of his own action, had broken something loose inside him. The present was too heavy to hold, so his mind fled backward, seeking the source of the fracture, the first dissonant chord in a life that was supposed to have been a symphony. The crinkle of the paper in his fist was the first sound to pull him under. It was the sound of his own scores, the thick, hopeful sheets he used to fill with frantic black notes. It triggered the memory of his father's hands. He couldn't have been more than 16. He had finished his first string quartet, a piece brimming with all the clumsy, earnest passion of youth, and he had presented it to his father not for approval, but for acknowledgement. He just wanted the man to see him. He remembered the feel of his father's hands, the rough, calloused skin of an engineer holding the delicate manuscript pages. There was a moment of silence, a space where a boy's hope could live and breathe. Then came the sound, a soft but distinctly dismissive sigh that felt louder than a shout. It was followed by the rustle of the pages being placed neatly on a table. "A fine hobby, Jared," his father's voice had rumbled, a low structural sound like shifting bedrock. The tone was not unkind, but it was worse. It was terminally practical. "It's complex. I can see you worked hard, but it won't build a bridge. It won't pave a road. It's an indulgence in noise." An indulgence in noise. His father hadn't understood that for Jared it was the opposite of noise. It was the only thing that made sense of it. It was the architecture of feeling, the logic of the heart. But the verdict had been delivered. In the world his father understood, the real world of concrete and steel, his passion was a frivolity. A foundation of self-doubt had been laid that day, and Jared had spent the rest of his life trying and failing to build a fortress on top of it. A cold sweat slicked his palms, and he shifted his grip on the notice. The tightness in his chest wasn't just anxiety, it was the phantom ache of a much deeper wound, a betrayal that had taught him to guard his soul. His mind recoiled from his father's memory only to land on one far sharper, far more poisonous, Marcus Thorne. The memory began with a sound, a pure, soaring melody for a solo cello that had woken Jared from a dream. It was a gift from the ether, one of those rare, perfect phrases that composers wait a lifetime for. It felt sacred. He captured it on paper, his hands shaking with the thrill of creation. It was the most honest thing he had ever written, and he had given it away. He had shown it to Marcus, his celebrated mentor, in the hushed, reverent space of the conductor's studio. He remembered the feeling of Marcus's hand on his shoulder, the warmth of it, the weight of his approval. He remembered Marcus's voice, a smooth, cultured baritone that dripped with encouragement. "Brilliant, my boy, truly, a work of profound heart. It's a bit raw, but the soul is there. Let me help you develop it. Let's find the right vessel for this." Jared had trusted him completely. He gave him the score, gave him his heart on a page. Weeks turned into months. Marcus became distant. His calls went unanswered. Jared, young and naive, assumed the great man was simply busy. Then came the broadcast. A Saturday afternoon classical program on the radio. Jared had been making coffee, the rich aroma filling his tiny student apartment. He was humming the melody, his melody, as he worked on another piece, and then he heard it. It poured from the radio speakers, no longer a raw, solitary cello voice, but a lush, orchestral behemoth. It was his melody, his sacred phrase, now dressed in Marcus Thorne's bombastic, self-important orchestration. It was still beautiful, but it had been corrupted, its intimate vulnerability replaced by a grandiose sentimentality. Jared's blood went cold. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, but he barely heard the noise. He only heard the announcer's voice, crisp and bright. And that was the world premiere of the stunning new adagio from Marcus Thorne's latest symphony, Urban Requiem. A truly masterful moment from a modern genius. Masterful, genius. Marcus had not just stolen his music, he had stolen a piece of his identity and sold it to the world as his own. That was the day Jared had started building walls around his heart. that was the day he became afraid. If he poured his true soul into his work, it would either be stolen or, worse, ignored. And so he had retreated, focusing on the technical, the complex, the proficient. He built intricate, beautiful vessels and left them empty, because he couldn't bear to have their content stolen again. The critic's words weren't a revelation. They were a confirmation of a sickness that had taken root years ago. The memory left a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. Shuddering, he was pulled back to the present by the oppressive quiet of his apartment. The need for a real, human connection was suddenly overwhelming, a desperate, primal urge. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The smooth, cold glass felt slick against his damp skin. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over one name, Clara. He pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear, listening to the hollow, synthetic ring. One ring, two. He was about to hang up when he heard the click of connection. "Jared, is everything okay?" Her voice was a mixture of surprise and immediate worry. It was the sound of his entire relationship with his family, all in one sentence. "Yeah, Clara. Everything's fine," he lied, his own voice sounding rough and foreign to his ears. "Just calling to say hi." "Oh, hi." A beat of awkward silence. He could hear the faint, muffled sounds of traffic through her phone. She was probably walking home from her law office, her life moving forward on a straight, predictable track. "It's just, you never just call to say hi. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he insisted, the lie feeling like sandpaper in his throat. "Okay," she said, unconvinced. Another pause, then the script began. "Dad was asking about you. He said, well, you know." He mentioned that position at his firm again. "In the records department. It's stable, Jared. Good benefits. You're so smart you could do anything." Each word was meant kindly, he knew, but they landed like stones. Stable, benefits, practical. They were the words of his father's world, a world where a dream was a liability. He felt a familiar, hot flush of frustration. "I'm a composer, Clara." "I know," she sighed, a sound heavy with years of this same conversation. "But you're not. I mean, is it working? Are you happy?" "I'm fine," he said, his voice tight. "Because it doesn't sound fine. We're just worried. We love you. We don't want to see you struggle." He couldn't take it. The well-meaning, suffocating concern was worse than outright dismissal. It was a gentle hand pushing his head under the water, telling him it was for his own good. "You don't get it," he finally snapped, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "None of you do. This isn't about struggling. This is about breathing. This is who I am." A hurt silence stretched across the line, thick and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its warmth. It was cool and professional, the voice she probably used with difficult clients. "I'm just trying to help, Jared. Someone has to be practical." Click. She was gone. He was left holding the phone to his ear, listening to the empty, mocking hum of the dial tone. He had reached out for a lifeline and had been handed an anchor. Slowly, he lowered the phone. He was more alone now than he had been 5 minutes before. The eviction notice, his father's judgment, Marcus's theft, Clara's practicality. They were the four walls of his prison. He slipped the notice into his back pocket. The sharp crinkle of the paper was the only sound he made, a final discordant note in the crushing silence. The silence after the call with Clara was heavier than the silence before. It was no longer a passive emptiness. It had become an active presence, a pressure that pressed in on Jared's chest. He had reached for a connection and had only received confirmation of his own solitude. The final door had closed. The resistance in him crumbled. He sat before his laptop, the monotonous hum of its fan the only sound. He was doing the thing he'd thought unimaginable only hours before. He was looking for a job. Not a teaching gig or a part-time arranging position, but a real job. A job with benefits and stability. A job that was a tomb for the soul. The screen gave off a cold, clinical light. He didn't have to see the words, he could feel them, the dry, sterile language of the corporate world. Data entry specialist, administrative assistant, records coordinator, each title was a nail. The descriptions washed over him, a symphony of alien terms, streamline workflows, proactive, synergize, detail-oriented. It was the language of another planet, a reality for which he had no dictionary. Each click of the mouse felt heavy, final, like a hammer blow. He filled out an application, his fingers moving mechanically on the cool plastic keys. Name, address, work history, a disjointed list of the temporary jobs he'd taken to survive. He paused at the skills section. Proficient in counterpoint, expert in orchestral arrangement, composition. He deleted it all. It had no value here. Instead, he typed, proficient in Microsoft Office Suite, fast typing speed. The humiliation was a bitter acid in the back of his throat. He was about to click submit on a position at an insurance firm, a final act of surrender, when another sound intruded. Knock, knock. It was so soft, so tentative, he almost thought it was a noise from the building's old pipes. He ignored it, his gaze fixed on the button on the screen. Knock, knock, knock. More insistent this time, but still gentle. An irritation. He didn't want to speak to anyone. He didn't want to put on the mask that said everything is fine. He wanted to be left alone with his misery. With a frustrated sigh, he rose and shuffled to the door, opening it just a crack. It was Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor. He couldn't see her clearly, but he could hear her voice, a gentle, reedy sound with a tremor that was like the rustle of old paper. She was holding an empty jar. "Hello, Jared. I am so sorry to bother you," she said. "I was in the middle of a cup of tea and discovered I'm all out of sugar. I was wondering if I might borrow a spoonful." It was a simple, mundane request, a tiny piece of normalcy that broke the suffocating atmosphere of his despair. "Yes, of course, Mrs. Gable. One moment." He left the door ajar and went to his kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He found the sugar canister, scooped some into her jar, and brought it back to the door. As she took it, her dry, thin fingers brushed against his. "Thank you, dear boy," she said. She paused, not turning to leave right away. "Pardon me for saying so, but you seem troubled." Her tone wasn't nosy, merely observant, filled with a genuine, unobtrusive concern that disarmed him. "It's just been a difficult day," he mumbled, his eyes on the floor. "I know those days," she said softly. She started to turn away, then stopped, facing the narrow opening of the door again. "You know," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "I haven't heard you play in a while. These walls are quite thin. Sometimes on my difficult days, your music was the only thing that made sense. I miss it." She didn't wait for a response. She gave his arm a light, papery touch, and then he heard the soft shuffle of her slippers as she moved back to her apartment. The sound of her door clicking shut left a silence more profound than before. Her words remained, hanging in the air. Your music was the only thing that made sense, not for him, but for someone else. When it no longer made sense to him, it had been something for a stranger on the other side of a wall. It wasn't a compliment about his skill, it was a testament to its effect. It was a purpose, however small, it was a connection. He closed the door. He didn't go back to the laptop. Instead, he was drawn to the piano, as if by an unseen force. He stood before it for a long moment. Then, with a slow, almost reverent motion, he reached out and lifted the lid. The thump was softer this time, a sound of possibility, not of finality. A faint scent of dust and old wood rose to meet him. He sat down, his fingers hovered over the keys, feeling their cool, familiar smoothness. He didn't think about theory. He didn't think about structure. He didn't try to impress a committee or a critic. He just thought of the hollowness inside him, of his father's dismissal, Marcus's betrayal, Clara's worry, and Mrs. Gable's quiet loneliness. He pressed a single key, a C minor. The note hung in the room, clean and sad and true. And then he played. The music that came out was not for an audition or a concert hall. It was a prayer, a confession, a primal scream rendered in melody. It was the sound of his own breaking heart. It was messy, it was raw, it was imperfect, and it was completely, devastatingly honest. It was anything but hollow. When he finished, his breathing was ragged, and he felt a wetness on his cheeks. He felt scoured out, exhausted but not empty, cleansed. On a pure, unthinking impulse, he grabbed his phone, propped it up on the music stand, and played the piece again. He captured the raw audio with all its imperfections, the creak of the pedal, the faint hiss of the room, the tremor in the quiet passages. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. He navigated to an obscure free audio streaming site he'd never used before. He created an account with a single word, Ghostwriter. He uploaded the file. In the title box, he typed the first words that came to mind, a dedication to the woman who had unknowingly saved him, and to himself. For the unheard, the upload bar slowly filled. A soft whoosh sound from his computer speakers confirmed it was done. He closed the laptop. He expected nothing. The act itself was the point. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a quiet, fragile sense of peace. He had made something not to be judged, but simply to exist. And in that moment, it was enough. Miles away, in another room lit by the artificial glow of a screen, there was a different kind of sound. It was not a heavy silence, but a frantic mechanical rhythm. The sharp click of a mouse, the rapid tap, tap, tap of keys, and the incessant whir of an overworked computer fan. This was the sound of creation on the brink of desperation. Lena was hunched over her keyboard, a knot of tension pulled tight between her shoulder blades. She no longer saw the images on her monitor. She felt them, every beat, every cut, every frame seared into her mind after hundreds of viewings. Her film, her thesis, Metropolis Heartbeat, was there. The story of loneliness in a sea of people, of connections almost made and then lost, existed in the silent footage. It was a body, meticulously assembled. But it had no heartbeat. It had no breath. The problem was the silence. She had tried to fill it, but everything she tried was wrong. For 3 days, she had been lost in the particular hell of royalty-free music libraries. She clicked on a track titled Pensive Cityscape. A generic, looping synthesizer melody oozed into her headphones, antiseptically clean and devoid of feeling. It was a postcard of sadness, not sadness itself. She groaned and moved to the next one. Melancholy reflections. More synthetic strings, dripping with a false emotion engineered to fit everything and mean nothing. The frustration felt physical, a pressure building behind her eyes. These tracks were too perfect, too produced. They had no air, no room hiss, no tremor of a human hand. They had no flaws, and therefore they had no truth. Her film was about the messy, flawed truth of human emotion, and to plaster it with a glossy coat of corporate music felt like a betrayal. The deadline for her final cut was approaching like an oncoming train. Panic was beginning to set in, a cold sensation that started in her gut. She had poured everything into this project, begging for equipment, calling in favors from friends, fueling it with sleepless nights and what little money she had. To fail at this final hurdle, to be unable to find the voice for her own film, was unbearable. In an act of desperation, she closed the tabs for the professional libraries. She began to dive deeper into the web, into the dusty, unlit corners where amateurs posted their work, forums, free streaming sites, digital archives of sound. It was a hopeless search, a sift through a sea of noise, of bad recordings and half-finished melodies. With every click, her hope diminished. It was long past midnight. The air in her room smelled of hot metal from her computer and the bitter, cold coffee in the mug beside her. Her eyes burned. She was ready to give up, to just pick one of the soulless synthesizer tracks and accept defeat. She clicked one last link, drawn by a strange title on a website with a stark, simple interface. The title wasn't Sad City or Lonely Night. It was simply, For the Unheard. She pressed play. For a moment there was nothing but a soft, static hiss. And then it came. A single piano note, a C minor, bloomed in her headphones. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. She could hear the air in the room where it was recorded, the almost inaudible press of a pedal, the weight of a finger on a key, and then the melody began. Lena's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't a song, it was a confession. It was all the loneliness, all the longing, all the quiet ache she had tried to capture with her camera. It had the complexity of someone trained, but it carried the raw vulnerability of an open wound. The sadness in it was profound, but underneath it, there was something else, an undercurrent of defiance, a single, fragile note of beauty that refused to be extinguished. It was the voice of her film. It was the voice of her own heart. A jolt of pure, electric adrenaline shot through her, chasing away all fatigue. This is it. This is the one. Her frustration instantly transformed into a new, urgent mission. This wasn't just about finding a soundtrack anymore. This was about finding the person who made it. She felt a deep, inexplicable connection to the anonymous artist. Someone else out there, somewhere in this loud, chaotic city, felt the world the same way she did. She frantically searched for a name, an email, anything. There was nothing, only the username. Ghostwriter, no profile, no other tracks. The song had 17 listens, 17. She felt as though she had stumbled upon a secret, a message in a bottle cast into the digital ocean. She listened to the piece again, and then again, the sound filling her small workspace, weaving the emotional tapestry her silent images needed. She no longer just needed this music for her film. She needed to know the person behind it. Her exhaustion was gone, replaced by a fervent energy. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She left comments beneath the track, pleas sent out into the void. This is beautiful. Who are you? I'm a filmmaker. This is the soul of my film. I need to find you, please. Your music made me feel understood. Thank you. Please let me know how I can reach you. The frantic clicking had returned, but now it was not the sound of frustration. It was the sound of hope, an urgent knocking on an invisible door, praying that someone on the other side would hear. For a full day, Jared did not touch the laptop. He left it closed on his small desk, a silent black rectangle that held the evidence of his moment of raw, uncalculated honesty. The act of creation had felt like a necessary exorcism, a lancing of a wound. But in the stark, quiet light of the following day, it felt like a reckless exposure. He was terrified to look. He knew what he would find, a listen count of one, his own, and a vast, indifferent silence. It was better not to confirm it, to let the desperate act fade into a half-forgotten memory. But the curiosity was a persistent itch, a low-grade fever in his blood. By late afternoon, the need to know, the need to see the tangible proof of his own insignificance, became unbearable. It was a form of self-punishment he felt he deserved. With a sense of grim finality, he sat down, the chair groaning under his weight, and opened the machine. The fan whirred to life. He avoided the job application websites. He avoided his email. With a deep breath, his fingers moved with a practiced reluctance to the obscure streaming site. The page loaded. He saw the number first. It was not 0, it was not 1, it was 23, a meaningless number, and yet it sent a strange flutter through his chest. And then, beneath the title, he saw a hyperlink. Comments. 3. His blood ran cold. With a trembling hand, he clicked. The words appeared, stark and clear. 3 messages, all from the same username, a filmmaker. This is beautiful. Who are you? I'm a filmmaker. This is the soul of my film. I need to find you, please. Your music made me feel understood. Thank you. Please let me know how I can reach you. The words did not land as praise. They landed as an accusation. A spotlight had been thrown on him when he had been trying to hide in the dark. His first sensation was not joy or validation. It was a jolt of pure, undiluted fear. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. They're a student. His mind rationalized, scrambling for a defense. An amateur. They don't know any better. They don't know what they're hearing. The words from the fellowship rejection letter screamed in his memory, a deafening counterpoint to the filmmaker's plea. This filmmaker was wrong. They had mistaken a spasm of pain for a work of art. If he responded, if he stepped into that light, he would be exposed. They would see him for the fraud he was. The piece was a fluke, a desperate cry in the dark, not a repeatable act of skill or authentic talent. The fear of being seen, and then inevitably being understood as a failure, was paralyzing. He felt the phantom weight of his father's disappointment, the sting of Marcus's silent theft, proof that his work was only valuable when it was no longer his. He shoved the laptop away, the plastic feet scraping against the wood of the desk. He had to get out. The air in the apartment was suddenly too thin to breathe. The walls felt as if they were shrinking, the silence pressing in on him. He pulled open his door, not knowing where he was going, only needing to move. The hallway was empty, but as he stepped out, the door to Mrs. Gable's apartment opened a crack. The warm, comforting scent of brewing tea and something sweet, perhaps cinnamon, drifted out, a stark contrast to the stale, stagnant air of his own home. He heard the soft clinking of a ceramic mug against a saucer. She must have heard his door. She peered out, her presence a small, quiet anchor in his swirling panic. "Jared, good morning," she said, her reedy voice a gentle sound. He mumbled a greeting, his throat tight. She didn't ask if he was all right. She didn't press. She simply held her teacup in her thin, steady hands. "It is a brave thing, you know," she said, her tone conversational, as if she were merely commenting on the weather, "to put something new into the world. A book, a song, even just a kind thought. Most people are too afraid of what others will think, too afraid it won't be perfect." She wasn't looking at him, but past him, her thoughts seemingly on something else entirely. But the words, spoken with no knowledge of his turmoil, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Brave. No one had ever called him that. Talented, yes. Foolish, certainly. Impractical, always, but never brave. She gave him a small, unassuming smile. "Well, enjoy the day," she said, and retreated back into her apartment, the door closing with a soft click. Jared stood alone in the hallway. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in his gut. It told him to run, to walk down the stairs and out into the anonymous city, to let this filmmaker's message become just another unanswered echo. It was the safe thing to do. It was the easy thing to do. But her words stood in opposition. Brave. It was a choice. A single, terrifying choice. It was the choice between the familiar prison of his fear and the terrifying uncertainty of a door that had just been cracked open. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air tasting of dust and his neighbor's tea. He turned around. The sound of his own footsteps was unnaturally loud as he walked back into his apartment and closed the door behind him. He sat down at the desk. He pulled the laptop towards him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, silent drumbeat. He created a new email account, a simple, anonymous address that couldn't be traced back to him. He opened a new message, addressing it to the email the filmmaker had left in her comment. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a long, agonizing moment he was frozen, the battle raging inside him. Then he thought of Mrs. Gable. He thought of her quiet kindness. He thought of the word brave. He typed. The message was short, the words feeling huge and heavy. I am the composer. How can I help? He read it a dozen times. His finger moved to the send button, hovering over the smooth, cool surface he could feel through the screen. He closed his eyes. He clicked. A soft whoosh from the computer speakers confirmed the message was gone, sent out into the world. The sound was tiny, almost inaudible. But in the crushing silence of his apartment, it felt as momentous and terrifying as a cannon shot. The intervening 24 hours after he sent the email were a unique form of torture. Jared existed in a state of suspended animation. Every phantom vibration of his phone, every ping of a new email, sending a jolt of pure dread through his system. He swung wildly between two poles of terror. The fear that she wouldn't reply, and the even greater fear that she would. The reply came in the middle of the night. It was short and direct, a series of coordinates for a coffee shop and a time for the following afternoon. There was no effusive praise, no probing questions, just a simple, professional summons. It felt like an appointment for his own execution. He arrived 20 minutes early, a bundle of raw, jangling nerves. The coffee shop was a cacophony of sounds that grated on his frayed senses. The high-pitched hiss and clank of the espresso machine, the sharp clatter of ceramic cups, the low, indistinct murmur of a dozen overlapping conversations. He found a small table in a corner and wrapped his cold hands around a warm, heavy mug, the heat a small, insufficient anchor in a storm of anxiety. He was convinced this was a mistake. She would see him, hear the hesitation in his voice, and the illusion of the music would be shattered. She would see the fraud. He was staring into the dark liquid in his cup when a voice cut through the noise. Ghostwriter. He looked up. The voice was clear and direct, without a trace of judgment or expectation. It belonged to a young woman whose presence was defined not by her appearance, but by an unmistakable energy, a focused, vibrant intensity that seemed to create its own quiet space in the middle of the room's chaos. For a moment his throat closed up. He managed to force a single word out: Jared. The initial awkwardness he had been dreading never fully materialized. It was there for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty, but it dissolved with surprising speed. She slid into the chair opposite him, and the first thing she did was talk about the music. She didn't ask for his credentials. She didn't ask where he had studied or what he had worked on before. She spoke about the piece itself, and she used words he had only ever used in the privacy of his own mind. There's an honesty in it, she said, her voice low and passionate, leaning forward slightly. So much of the music you find is polished to the point of being sterile. Yours, it breathes. I could hear the room it was in. I could hear the feeling behind the notes. It wasn't just sad, it was resilient. That's what I've been looking for. To hear his work, a piece born of pure, unadulterated despair, described as resilient, was a revelation. A profound sense of relief washed over him, so potent it was almost dizzying. She wasn't looking for a technician. She wasn't impressed by his hollow proficiency. She had heard the tiny, trembling note of hope beneath all the pain. She had heard the truth. I want to show you something, she said, her movements sharp and purposeful as she pulled a laptop from her bag. The sound of the clasps opening was decisive. "Then you'll understand." She turned the laptop to face him and handed him a pair of well-worn headphones. He put them on, and the chaotic noise of the coffee shop vanished, replaced by a faint electronic hum. "There's no sound," she said. "That's the problem." He pressed play. He did not see a film. He heard one. He didn't focus on the images, but on the rhythm of the edits, the silent emotional beats, the story of two lonely souls moving through a vast, indifferent city, their paths crossing without ever truly meeting. He felt the weight of their unspoken words, the ache of their near-miss connections. He understood the narrative on a fundamental, compositional level. He could already hear the music in his head, the melodies, the harmonies, the silences. It was as if she had created a perfectly shaped vessel, and he was the only one in the world who held the liquid to fill it. When it ended, he took off the headphones, the sounds of the coffee shop rushing back in. He was quiet for a long moment, the world of her film still echoing in his mind. Then he began to speak. "The opening," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "It needs that same core melody from the piece you heard, but sparser. Just a single instrument, maybe a cello." Her focus was absolute. "Yes," she breathed. "And in the middle, when they almost touch on the subway platform, the harmony has to be unresolved. It should hang there, full of tension, leaving the listener feeling the missed connection." Her eyes lit up with a flash of pure, unadulterated excitement. "And that unresolved harmony can be a variation of the main theme," she jumped in, her words tumbling out, "to show how they're connected even when they're apart. It's the same musical DNA." The conversation ignited. It was no longer an interview, it was a collaboration. An idea from him was met with an idea from her, each one building on the last, a rapid-fire exchange of creative energy. The cold knot of anxiety in Jared's stomach was gone, completely burned away by a forgotten feeling, the pure, thrilling joy of creation. Back in his apartment that evening, everything felt different. The air was no longer heavy with failure. It was charged with possibility. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the hum of new melodies forming in his mind, clear and confident. He sat at the piano. When his fingers touched the keys, they no longer felt like the tombstone of his ambitions. They felt like partners, like extensions of his own voice. The music from Metropolis Heartbeat did not have to be dragged from him. It flowed, it poured out, honest and clear, unburdened by the fear of judgment. His creative block, the dam of fear and self-doubt that had held him captive for so long, had been shattered by the simple, profound act of being heard. Lena had been upfront about the payment. It was a few $100s, all her student budget could afford. It was barely enough to make a dent in his financial abyss. But as he worked late into the night, the sound of powerful, resonant music filling his small room, he knew the money was irrelevant. The validation, the harmony of a shared vision, the simple purpose of making something beautiful with someone who understood, that was the real payment. It was priceless. He had a reason to play again. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of sound. For the first time in months, Jared's apartment was not a space of oppressive silence, but a place of active creation. The tentative, searching notes of a new melody would rise from the piano, followed by the soft, rhythmic scratch of a pencil on score paper as he captured the idea. The work was an anchor, a tangible purpose that quieted the frantic noise in his head. This new, fragile sense of self-worth, born from the simple act of being heard by another, gave him a surplus of something he hadn't possessed in years: courage. It was this courage that led him, one afternoon, to stop his work. The melody he was composing felt strong and clear, but he knew there was a dissonance in his own life that needed to be addressed. He picked up his phone. The cool, smooth glass felt familiar in his hand, but his intention was different. The last time he had called his sister, he had been a drowning man grasping for a raft. This time he was calling as someone who had found solid ground, however small the patch might be. The familiar knot of dread formed in his stomach as he selected Clara's name, but it was smaller now, less powerful. He was not calling to defend himself or to ask for help. He was calling simply to try. He took a breath and pressed the button. The electronic ring sounded once, twice. He heard the click of connection. Jared. Clara's voice was cautious. Each syllable braced for impact. He could hear the faint, professional hum of an office in the background. She was expecting another round of their painful, circular argument. He didn't give it a chance to start. "Hi, Clara," he began, his own voice sounding quieter than he expected. "Listen, I wanted to apologize." A beat of stunned silence on the other end of the line. He could almost feel her confusion through the phone. He pushed forward, the words feeling awkward but necessary. "I wanted to apologize for the other day, for how I ended the call. You were trying to help, and I wasn't in a good place to hear it. I was wrong to snap at you." This simple admission, this act of taking responsibility, seemed to alter the very fabric of the conversation. The defensive tension that always existed between them suddenly slackened. "Oh," was all she said at first. The hum of her office seemed to recede. "Jared, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he insisted gently. And then he did something he had never done before. Instead of armoring himself in defiance, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Something happened," he said. "I'm working on a project. It's a small thing, a student film. It doesn't pay much." He could sense her preparing her usual practical objections, so he quickly continued. "But it's not about the money, Clara. It feels like I can breathe again. Like I remembered the reason I started doing this in the first place. He paused, searching for the right words to bridge the gap between their worlds. "When you and Dad talk about getting a real job, I know you do it because you love me. But it feels like you're asking me to stop breathing, just because the air I need is different from yours. This project, it's like a breath of fresh air. It makes me feel like I'm not hollow." He could hear her own quiet breathing on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, the guarded, professional tone was gone, replaced by something softer, something that sounded like the sister he remembered from their childhood. "I don't understand it, Jared," she admitted, and the honesty in her voice was its own kind of truce. "Not really. I don't think I ever will. But I can hear that it matters to you. The way you're talking right now, you sound different, lighter." It wasn't a full absolution. It wasn't a sudden, miraculous conversion to his way of life. But it was an acceptance of him. It was a fragile, crucial moment of understanding that felt more significant than any professional accomplishment. They didn't solve all their problems, but for the first time in years, the call ended not with a resigned sigh, but with a genuine warmth, a shared hope. The profound sense of lightness from the call stayed with him for the rest of the day. Later, on his way to the grocery store, he walked past the grand concert hall where Marcus Thorne was scheduled to conduct the city's Philharmonic. A large poster bearing the man's name hung by the entrance. Jared stopped. He braced himself for the familiar surge of hot, bitter anger, the phantom sickness of betrayal. He waited for it, but it didn't come. Instead, he felt a strange, quiet sense of detachment. The memory was still there, a permanent scar on his history, but it no longer throbbed with fresh pain. Marcus had stolen a melody, a single beautiful phrase, but he hadn't stolen his ability to create new ones. He hadn't stolen the connection Jared was now building with Lena. He hadn't stolen the fragile peace he had just made with his sister. Jared's worth was not locked away in that one stolen piece, nor was it defined by that one man's treachery. It was being forged right now, in his small apartment, note by honest note. He turned away from the poster and continued down the street. The sounds of the city, the rumble of traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the overlapping chatter of voices, no longer felt like an oppressive, chaotic noise. For the first time in a very long time, it sounded less like an adversary and more like a symphony, vast and complex. And he was finally ready to compose his own part within it. The final note of the score faded, leaving a profound and resonant silence in Jared's small apartment. He and Lena sat without speaking for a long moment, the emotional echo of the music still hanging in the air. The silence was not awkward or empty. It was full, a shared space of completion and satisfaction. They had done it. They had taken her silent, aching story and his raw, lonely melody and woven them into a single, cohesive voice. "It's done," Lena finally whispered, her voice full of a quiet awe. It was as if she were afraid to speak too loudly, lest she break the spell. "It's done," Jared agreed, a feeling of deep, settled peace spreading through his chest. Lena's laptop was open, the final audio file saved on her desktop. He heard the soft clicking of her trackpad as she navigated through folders. "The deadline for the City Student Film Festival is tonight," she said, her tone casual, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I wasn't going to bother, it's so competitive. But now," she trailed off. "You should submit it," Jared said, the words surprising him with their own certainty. "Really?" "Yes." There was no further debate. On a shared impulse, more as a final, definitive act of closure for the project than with any real expectation of success, she began to fill out the online form. Jared listened to the rhythmic tap of the keys as she entered the film's details. When she got to the composer credit, she paused. "Is ghostwriter okay?" she asked. He thought for a moment of the fear that had made him choose the name. Then he thought of the quiet courage he had felt in the days since. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Use my name, Jared." She typed it in. A few more clicks, and then the soft whoosh of the upload confirmation sounded from her speakers. And that was it. The film, with his name attached to it, was out in the world, a tiny, hopeful message sent out into the vast, indifferent ocean of the city's creative scene. A week passed. The memory of their collaboration was a warm, fading ember. Jared tried to hold on to the creative energy, sketching out new musical ideas, but the old anxieties began to creep back in. The eviction notice was a cold, hard rectangle of reality in his pocket. The festival was a ridiculous long shot, and he knew it. He expected nothing. Then, his phone vibrated against his desk. It was Lena. He answered, and his ear was immediately filled with a torrent of breathless, excited sound. Her words were a jumble, running into each other in her haste. "Jared, I can't believe it. I just got the email we got in." His mind couldn't process the rush of sound. "What, Lena? Slow down." He heard her take a deep, ragged breath on the other end of the line. "We got in," she said, her voice now trembling with a mixture of shock and joy. "To the festival. Metropolis Heartbeat. We're a finalist." Jared was silent. The sounds of his apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of a passing train seemed to fade away. "You're serious?" I'm sending you the email right now." A moment later, a notification chimed on his laptop. He opened the message. The words were formal, official, but they felt like a shout. "Congratulations. We are pleased to inform you that your film has been selected as a finalist." A student film festival wasn't a Hollywood premiere. It wasn't a record deal. It wasn't even a paying gig. but it was something. It was a crack in the thick, unbreachable wall he had been facing for years. His work, his name, was going to be part of a public event, presented to a real audience. The fear was immediate and visceral, a cold plunge into a deep pool of self-doubt. But this time, the fear was mixed with something else, a powerful, unfamiliar current of hope that pulled him toward the surface. Miles away, in a quiet, sound-proofed office where the only noise was the whisper of a state-of-the-art air filter, Marcus Thorne let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. The sound was smooth and condescending. He was idly flipping through the glossy, heavyweight pages of the festival's printed program, a task he performed each year as one of its primary patrons. His finger, tracing down a list of student shorts, had stopped on a familiar name. Original score by Jared. Well, he murmured to the man sitting opposite him, a junior board member. Something of interest, maestro? The young man asked deferentially. Marcus tapped the page. A former student of mine, Jared. I remember him. A prodigious talent for mimicry, you know. He could replicate the style of any of the great masters. He paused, letting the faint praise hang in the air before delivering the killing blow. But no heart of his own, all technique, no soul. It seems he's found his level, writing little tunes for student films. Good for him. The dismissal was effortless, a casual swatting away of a forgotten annoyance. To Marcus, Jared was not a person he had wronged. He was a footnote, a minor character in the grand opera of his own success. But the junior board member, eager to show he was informed, offered a piece of information. I did hear a bit of a buzz about that one, actually, he said. A friend on the selection jury mentioned that the score was what made the film stand out. She called it surprisingly powerful. Marcus's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, irritation perhaps, passed behind his eyes. Powerful. The boy's work had never been powerful. It had been derivative. He smoothed the glossy page, his touch lingering on the name for a fraction of a second too long. A vague, proprietary curiosity began to stir. He decided, with the casual authority of a man who owned the room, that he might attend the screening. It would be amusing to see what the boy had managed to produce on his own. The air in the theater lobby was a thick, humming curtain of sound. 100 conversations, fragments of laughter, and the clinking of ice in glasses all blended into a low, anxious roar. Jared felt utterly transparent, a ghost haunting a party he hadn't been invited to. The collar of the new shirt he'd bought, an extravagance that had cost him his grocery money for the week, felt rough and tight against his neck, a constant scratching reminder that he did not belong here. He stood beside Lena, who was a vibrating current of nervous energy. She wasn't speaking, but he could feel her excitement and fear radiating from her like heat. Whatever happens, thank you, she whispered to him, her voice almost lost in the din. Before he could respond, she gave his hand a quick, firm squeeze, a small, grounding gesture in the overwhelming sea of noise. Then the doors to the theater opened, and the crowd began to move. They found their seats. As the theater filled, the murmur around him grew, a tapestry of self-important chatter about cinematic theory, industry gossip, and the quiet, desperate hum of ambition. Jared's heart was a frantic, irregular drumbeat against his ribs. He felt a primal urge to flee, to run back to the safety of his anonymous, silent apartment. He was pinned to his seat by a mixture of terror and a sliver of hope he barely dared to acknowledge. Then, a hush fell over the room as the lights began to dim. A profound, expectant silence descended, a collective held breath. And in that darkness, the first note of his music sounded. The solitary cello theme, the one born from his conversation with Lena, filled the space. Hearing it through a professional, perfectly calibrated sound system was a deeply surreal experience. It was no longer a small sound coming from his tinny speakers. It was an entity. It had weight, texture, and dimension. It wrapped around him, immense and intimate at the same time. He wasn't just hearing the notes, he was hearing the resonant soul of the instrument, the almost imperceptible slide of fingers on the strings, the very air and breath he had poured into it. He closed his eyes, tuning out the images on the screen that he already knew by heart. He chose instead to listen to the room. He listened to the 100 strangers sitting in the dark with him. He could hear the subtle shifts in their collective breathing, the way the air seemed to still during the most delicate piano passages. During one particularly poignant musical swell, he heard a distinct, quiet sniffle from the row behind him. At the moment of the near miss on the subway platform, when the harmony hung, unresolved and aching, he heard a soft, shared intake of breath from somewhere to his left. They were not just watching, they were feeling. They were feeling what he had felt when he wrote it. In the darkness of the theater, his private language of pain and hope was being understood. The validation of it was a silent, overwhelming wave that left him breathless. When the final gentle chord faded into silence and the credits began to roll, there was a perfect, suspended moment of stillness, and then the space erupted. The sound was a physical force, a wave of applause that washed over him, not the polite clapping of a stuffy concert hall, but a genuine, heartfelt roar of appreciation. And now, please welcome the directors of our short film finalists to the stage for a brief Q&A, a smooth, amplified voice announced. Jared shrank down in his seat as Lena made her way to the stage, wanting only to be invisible. A host with a microphone asked the predictable questions to the other directors. Then he turned to Lena. The score for your film was incredibly powerful, almost a character in itself. Can you talk about your collaboration with the composer? Lena took the microphone. Her voice, amplified through the theater, was clear and strong, without a trace of the nervousness he'd felt from her earlier. I can't take much credit for that, she said, her voice ringing with sincerity. The film was just a body until the composer, Jared, gave it a soul. He didn't just write music for the story, he wrote the truth of the story. I was just lucky enough to find him. The public tribute, the unreserved, shining praise from this brilliant artist he so admired, left Jared stunned. He felt a hot flush creep up his neck, a mixture of embarrassment and a profound bone-deep gratitude. The award ceremony began soon after. Jared's mind was still reeling. He barely registered the announcements for cinematography and editing. Then, the host's voice cut through his daze. And the award for Best Short Film goes to Metropolis Heartbeat. A jolt, pure and electric, shot through him. He was on his feet, applauding with the rest of the room as Lena, her face a mask of joyous disbelief, accepted the award. He felt a genuine, selfless happiness for her that was so pure it momentarily eclipsed his own anxieties. This is enough, he thought to himself. This moment, right here, is more than I ever expected. He was already mentally preparing to leave, the night a success beyond his wildest imaginings. But the host held up a hand to quiet the applause. And this year, the smooth voice continued, the jury would like to award a special, discretionary prize. This is for an element of a film that the jury felt elevated a project from mere craft into the realm of true art. For a score that was not just an accompaniment, but a narrative voice in its own right. Jared's heart stopped. The special jury prize for outstanding achievement in a musical score, which comes with a $5,000 award, goes to... Time seemed to slow down, the voice of the announcer stretching out into an impossibly long moment. Jared, for Metropolis Heartbeat. Well, the sound of his own name, not whispered, not on a rejection letter, but spoken with honor into a microphone and broadcast to a room full of people, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He heard a collective gasp from the audience, then another wave of applause, this one different, this one aimed directly at him. Lena was grabbing his arm, her own elation for him overflowing. He felt dizzy, a sense of profound, world-altering disbelief washing over him. $5,000. The number was an absurdity, an impossibility from another reality. It wasn't just rent money, it was a lifeline. It was freedom. It was the sound of the eviction notice in his pocket being instantly, blessedly rendered silent. It was a provision so unexpected, so miraculous, that it felt like an answer to a prayer he had been too afraid to even whisper. He remained frozen in his seat, the roaring sound of applause washing over him, the warmth of Lena's hand on his arm the only thing keeping him grounded. And for the first time, he felt not like a ghost in the machine, but like someone who was finally, undeniably, being heard. Jared moved through the post-ceremony reception in a state of profound sensory overload. The low, celebratory hum of the crowded lobby, the clinking of glasses, and the overlapping waves of conversation all seemed to reach him through a thick layer of cotton. He felt disconnected from his own body, as if he were floating a few inches off the floor, an observer to his own life. The echo of the applause still seemed to be ringing in his ears, a phantom sound that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Lena was a warm, grounding presence beside him, her own joy for him a palpable energy that kept him from drifting away entirely. He was trying to process the impossible reality of the prize money, the absurd, beautiful number that had just changed the entire trajectory of his life, when a calm, clear voice cut through his daze. "Jared, a moment of your time." He turned. A woman with a presence of immense, quiet authority stood before him. He vaguely recognized her from the jury panel. "I'm Anya Sharma," she said, her voice professional and direct, devoid of the effusive gushing he'd heard from others. "I wanted to tell you personally. Your score was not just good, it was intelligent." The word struck him. No one had ever called his music intelligent, proficient, complex, but never intelligent. It understood the subtext of the film, she continued, her focus absolute. It did the work of a script without a single word. It trusted the audience's emotional intelligence. That is a rare quality. This was a different kind of validation. It wasn't about the beauty of the melody or the power of the emotion. It was about the craft. It was a recognition of the thought, the structure, the deep, compositional choices he had made. Coming from this woman, whose authoritative presence suggested she did not waste words, it meant more than a standing ovation. "I produce documentaries," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "We are often looking for composers who can tell a story, not just decorate it." She held something out to him. He reached for it automatically, his fingers closing around a piece of thick, heavy cardstock with a smooth, matte finish. It was a business card. "No promises," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. The words were a clear boundary, a defense against desperate hope. "But your work has a maturity that is rare. When you're ready to work on a bigger canvas, call me. And with that, she gave a slight nod and was gone. The sound of her heels clicking softly on the floor was the only evidence she had been there at all. Jared was left standing in the middle of the humming lobby, the card clutched in his hand. Its weight felt both immense and terrifying, a small rectangle of paper that held the impossible promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. The next morning, the dizzying euphoria had settled into a quiet, profound sense of peace. The world did not feel different, but he felt different within it. The first thing he did before making coffee, before even getting properly dressed, was sit at his laptop. He opened his landlord's online payment portal. The glaring red number of his overdue balance looked back at him, an old and familiar enemy. He transferred the prize money into his checking account. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he typed in the full amount he owed. His finger hovered over the confirm payment button. He took a breath and clicked. A soft ding of confirmation sounded from the laptop speakers. In that tiny, insignificant electronic sound, he heard the shattering of chains. He felt a physical weight, a pressure he had carried on his shoulders for years, simply dissolve. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep, shuddering breath. It was the first full, easy breath he had taken in a very long time. His next act was not for himself. He walked across the hall and knocked on Mrs. Gable's door. When she answered, he invited her to have dinner with him that evening, at a nice restaurant of her choice. She was flustered, protesting that it wasn't necessary, but he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. That evening, they sat opposite each other in a quiet Italian restaurant. The soft murmur of other diners, the gentle clinking of silverware, and the sound of a distant, tasteful piano created a warm, peaceful atmosphere. He told her everything that had happened at the festival. But the only reason any of it happened, he concluded, his voice full of a sincerity that surprised even himself, was because of you, because of what you said that day. "Oh, nonsense, dear boy," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I didn't do anything." "You did," he insisted. "You reminded me that music isn't about being judged. It's about connecting. You told me you missed it. You made me feel like my voice mattered, even if only to one person. You gave me the courage to try one last time." He pushed a small, carefully wrapped package across the table. "This is for you." He heard the soft tear of the paper as she opened it. It was a small set of first edition poetry books by a favorite author she had once mentioned in passing. There was a sharp, surprised intake of her breath, followed by a long silence. When he looked up, he heard the quiet, choked sound of her weeping. It was not a sound of sadness, but of someone who felt, after a long time, truly seen. Later that night, back in his apartment, the quiet was no longer a sign of loneliness, but of peace. The remaining prize money was a silent, comforting presence in his bank account, a buffer of security he had never known. The crisp business card from Anya Sharma sat on his desk, a terrifying and beautiful question mark. But his mind was not on his next big career move, or on the money. He was thinking of the sound of Mrs. Gable's quiet joy. He was learning to inhabit this new space of success, not with a frantic, grasping ambition, but with a strange and unfamiliar calm. He was learning to receive a gift without being crushed by the feeling of unworthiness, and to share it without needing applause. He was learning, note by quiet, thankful note, the grammar of grace. For 7 days, the business card was both a talisman and a tormentor. It was a tangible object, a small, heavy rectangle of paper that lived in Jared's pocket, its crisp, sharp edges, a constant reminder of an impossible choice. During the day, it was a weight against his leg as he walked. At night, it sat on his desk, and he would find himself tracing the embossed, elegant letters of Anya Sharma's name with his fingertip. The week was a long, silent war fought entirely within the battlefield of his own mind. One voice, the familiar, insidious whisper of his old fear, was relentless. "You're not ready," it hissed. The student film was a fluke, a lucky break. This is the real world. The deadlines are real, the expectations are real, and the failure will be real. You'll be exposed as a fraud, a one-hit wonder. You'll confirm what they all believe. You are emotionally hollow. But there was another voice now, quieter and less familiar, but persistent. It was a voice strengthened by a recent victory, a voice that spoke with the memory of the audience's applause and the warmth of a genuine connection. "But what if you are ready?" it countered. What if that piece wasn't a fluke, but a beginning? What if this is the chance you've been waiting for? By the seventh day, the torment of indecision had become greater than the fear of rejection. He knew with a dreadful certainty that to not make the call was a decision in itself. It was a choice to let the old voice win, to retreat back into the familiar, miserable safety of his silence. His hand was cold and slick with sweat as he picked up his phone and carefully dialed the number from the card. The electronic tones sounded unnaturally loud in his quiet apartment. He was about to hang up when a crisp, efficient voice answered. Anya Sharma's office. His own voice, when he managed to produce it, was a reedy, uncertain thing. My name is Jared. I was asked to call. A brief pause, the sound of a soft click, and then a new voice was on the line, as calm and authoritative as he remembered. Jared. I was wondering if you would call. There was no small talk. Anya Sharma did not waste time on pleasantries. I have a project I'd like you to consider. It's a high-profile nature documentary for a major streaming service. It's called The Silent Migration. It follows the 15-year life cycle of the Arctic tern, the animal with the longest migratory path on the planet. She spoke of vast, empty landscapes, of instinct, of solitude, of an epic journey undertaken in near total silence. The composer, she explained, would need to provide the entire emotional narrative to give voice to a silent world. Then her tone sharpened. I'll be direct. This would be a trial. The director is notoriously particular. The deadlines are aggressive. The post-production schedule is unforgiving. If you are not capable of delivering work of the highest professional quality under immense pressure, we will know very quickly. The words were a bucket of ice water, a terrifying gauntlet thrown down. But they were also, strangely, a sign of respect. She was not coddling him or patronizing him. She was speaking to him as a professional, laying out the stakes with brutal honesty. We would need 3 demo tracks based on the initial footage to be delivered in 2 weeks, she concluded. For that work, we can offer a fee of... The number she named was so far outside the realm of his reality that for a moment he felt a wave of vertigo, the sounds of the room seeming to recede. It was more money than he had earned from his music in the last 3 years combined. The fear was immense, a physical presence that made it hard to breathe. The old voice screamed at him to run, to make an excuse, to hang up the phone. But underneath the fear, the composer in him was already hearing it. The soaring string lines for the Arctic flight, the lonely piano for the solitary nesting, the percussive, driving rhythm for the relentless journey. He heard his own voice, surprisingly steady, say, I would be honored to try. A legal document arrived by courier the next day. It was a thick, heavy envelope. He sat with it for an hour, feeling the weight of the pages. The dense, legal language was a world away from the elegant language of a musical score, but its meaning was unmistakable. This was real. He found the signature line, and with a hand that trembled only slightly, signed his name. The drag of the pen on the thick paper felt momentous, a binding act. A few days later, the advance appeared in his bank account. Staring at the number on his phone screen, he felt not elation, but a profound, quiet stillness. This wasn't just a prize. It wasn't just a lucky break. It was a foundation. His first act was to find a new place to live. He didn't look for luxury. He found a small, clean one-bedroom apartment with one crucial feature: a small, windowless second room, perfect for insulating sound. His second act was to go to a professional music store. He walked past the entry-level equipment that had been the limit of his world for so long. He sat at a professional-grade digital piano. He touched the keys. The feeling was revelatory. They were weighted, solid, responding to his touch with a subtle, satisfying resistance, a world away from the light, sticky plastic he was used to. He pressed a chord. The sound that emerged from the monitors was pure and clean, a rich, resonant tone with no underlying electronic hiss, no cheap digital echo. It was simply the sound of the instrument itself. He bought it, along with a pair of studio-quality monitors and a proper audio interface, the swipe of his new debit card feeling surreal. The chapter ends with Jared in his new, empty studio space. The air smells faintly of fresh paint and new electronics. The silence in the room is absolute, a controlled, perfect quiet that he has never experienced before. His old apartment was quiet out of neglect. This room is quiet by design. He has everything set up. For a long moment he just sits, listening to the perfect, promising silence. Then, he reaches out and places his hands on the keys of his new piano. He plays a single, clear chord. The sound that fills the room is pure, clean, and full of an almost overwhelming possibility. There is no buzz from a faulty wire, no hiss from cheap speakers, no rattle from an old worn-out frame. It is just the sound of the music. He closes his eyes, takes a breath, and begins to work. The world, for Jared, had shrunk to the size of his small, quiet studio. The city outside, with its roaring symphony of chaos, had faded to a distant, irrelevant hum. His entire universe was contained in the space between his headphones. The clean, pure sound of the notes he played, the soft, satisfying click of his editing software, the rhythmic beat of his own focused heart. The 2 weeks Anya Sharma had given him were a crucible. The pressure was immense, a constant low-grade fever in his blood, but it was a different kind of pressure from the one he had known before. It was not the crushing weight of impending failure, but the invigorating challenge of professional expectation. He was no longer just an artist lost in his feelings. He was a craftsman, building something to specification, against a deadline. He was deep in the most complex passage of the score, layering the soaring flight of the Arctic tern with a subtle, melancholic undercurrent of its immense solitude, when his phone vibrated against the desk. The sudden, jarring buzz was an intrusion. He ignored it. It vibrated again, insistent. With a sigh of frustration, he glanced at the screen. The name displayed there made his blood run cold. Father. The single word was a bucket of ice. A knot of pure, conditioned dread tightened in his gut, a reflex honed over 20 years of difficult, painful conversations. His father never called him. Clara was always the designated ambassador, the bridge over the chasm of their misunderstanding. A direct call from him could only mean one thing: an emergency, a crisis. He snatched up the phone, his hands suddenly slick with sweat. He answered, his own voice a tight, croaked, "Hello, Jared." His father's voice was a low, gruff rumble, a sound he associated with structural assessments and pronouncements of fact. It was hesitant, which was so unlike him that it only amplified Jared's fear. "It's your father." A long, heavy silence stretched across the line, filled only by the faint crackle of the connection. Jared waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Clara told me," his father said finally, the words sounding effortful, as if he were lifting something heavy. "About the documentary, the contract." Another pause. Jared braced himself. He could already hear the lecture, the warnings about the instability of freelance work, the final plea to be practical, to take the safe job at the engineering firm. But the lecture never came. Instead, his father cleared his throat, a rough, gravelly sound. "I looked up the production company," he said, his tone factual, as if he were reading from a report. "They're a serious outfit, top-tier streaming service." Jared held his breath. "Good work, son." The 3 words were not emotional. There was no warmth, no apology for years of doubt, no grand cinematic speech of reconciliation, but they were, in their own way, more powerful. In his father's world of concrete evidence and tangible results, serious outfit and good work were the highest possible praise. It was an acknowledgement, a concession. It was a sign of respect, offered in the only language his father knew. For Jared, it felt like the shifting of a tectonic plate that had been stuck for his entire life. A deep foundational tension he had carried since childhood began finally to release. "Thanks, Dad," he managed to say, his voice thick. The rest of the call was short and predictably awkward, filled with stilted questions about his new apartment and the weather, but the underlying structure of their relationship had been irrevocably altered. A bridge had not been perfectly rebuilt, but the first, strongest support beam had just been lowered into place. A few days later, another unexpected call. The number was unrecognized. He answered it cautiously. "Jared, my boy, it's Marcus." The voice was unmistakable, the same smooth, cultured baritone that had once filled him with admiration and had later become the sound of his deepest betrayal. But as he heard it now, it didn't trigger the hot surge of rage he would have expected. Instead, he felt a strange, quiet detachment, a clinical curiosity. He could hear something new underneath the smooth surface of Marcus's voice, a faint, almost imperceptible strain. "Marcus," Jared said, his own voice calm and level. Marcus launched into a stream of effusive, hollow praise. "I heard the news, the festival, and now this documentary. Magnificent. I always knew you had it in you, of course. That technical brilliance, it just needed the right opportunity to shine. I am so terribly proud of what you've accomplished." The words were a masterful performance, a desperate attempt to rewrite history, to cast himself as the benevolent teacher who had always believed, not the thief who had stolen a piece of a young man's soul. The old Jared would have been wounded by the hypocrisy, or would have lashed out in anger. But the new Jared, the one who had his father's gruff respect in his ear, and a contract with his own name on it in his desk, felt nothing but a distant, quiet pity. He didn't need to fight this battle anymore. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need a confession. He realized with a sudden, liberating clarity that he was already free. "We simply must collaborate on something in the future," Marcus was saying, the suggestion an obvious attempt to align himself with Jared's rising star. "Thank you for the call, Marcus," Jared interrupted, his voice polite, measured, and completely neutral. "But I'm quite busy with my current projects. I have to go now." He ended the call with a soft, final click. There was no lingering anger, no residue of bitterness. Marcus Thorne had been reduced from the monster who had defined his past into a mere ghost, a powerless echo. Jared had received his double honor. The first was the gruff respect of his father, which had begun to heal a wound he'd thought was permanent. The second, and perhaps the greater, was the profound realization that he no longer needed anything at all from the man who had wronged him. He turned back to his piano, the silence of his studio welcoming him. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The music was clear, confident, and completely his own. Months passed, and the violent, dramatic shifts in Jared's life began to settle into a new, quiet rhythm. The sharp, terrifying highs and the crushing, desolate lows were replaced by something he had never known, a steady, purposeful cadence. His life was no longer a frantic, improvised piece full of jarring dissonances. It was becoming a composed, intentional work. The mornings began not with the jolt of an alarm, but with the soft, clear notes of a new melody forming in his mind. He would work for hours in the sanctuary of his studio, the only sounds being the pure tones from his piano, the soft clicks of his editing software, and the quiet, rhythmic scratch of his pencil on score paper. The work on The Silent Migration was the most demanding challenge of his career. He had regular calls with the director, a man whose voice was sharp, exacting, and relentlessly critical, but who spoke to Jared as a peer, a collaborator. In their intense conversations about translating the silent instinct of an animal into a musical theme, Jared felt the invigorating spark of true artistic partnership. He was not just a hired hand filling in the gaps, he was a storyteller. This newfound sense of purpose began to overflow into the other areas of his life. He found himself looking forward to his weekly calls with Lena. She was deep into writing the script for her first feature film, and he could hear in her voice the same frantic mixture of excitement and terror that he knew so well. "I'm just so afraid it's not good enough," she confessed during one call, her voice tight with anxiety. "What if I can't do it?" The old Jared would have had nothing to offer, but the new Jared found himself speaking with a quiet, calm authority. "It's not about being good enough," he said, the words feeling true as they left his lips. "It's about being honest. Tell your truth. The rest will follow." He wasn't giving her advice from a place of superior wisdom, but from the fresh, raw experience of his own journey. He was simply holding a light for her on a path he had just walked himself. His dinners with Mrs. Gable became a non-negotiable part of his schedule, an anchor of quiet humanity in his demanding work week. He would sit in her small, warm apartment, the air filled with the comforting scent of old books and brewing tea, and listen. He listened to her stories of a life lived, of loves won and lost, of the small, quiet joys that sustain a person through the years. Sometimes he would read poetry to her, his voice a steady, calm presence in the room, and he would hear her soft, contented sighs. These moments were a crucial counterpoint to the solitary intensity of his work. They reminded him that the grandest symphony is meaningless without the small, quiet notes of human connection. One evening he was leaving her apartment when she placed a dry, papery hand on his arm. "You seem at peace, Jared," she said, her voice soft. He considered her words. The eviction notice was gone. The prize money sat in his account, a silent guardian against the terror of destitution. But the peace she heard in him was something deeper. It was the absence of the constant, grinding noise of self-doubt. It was the feeling of a schedule that was full but not frantic. It was the quiet joy of a life that finally had a clear, resonant keynote. "I think I am," he said. He walked back to his studio. The final deadline for the documentary score was approaching. He felt the pressure, a firm, professional weight on his shoulders. But it was the healthy, functional pressure of a bridge under load, not the crushing, destructive pressure of a collapsing building. He was no longer a man defined by his failures or his miraculous success. He was defined by the steady, quiet rhythm of his work, his friendships, his own life. He was not just surviving anymore, he was composing. The sound of this premiere was different. The low, sophisticated murmur of the crowd in the Grand Theater lobby, the polite clinking of wine glasses, the undercurrent of important industry conversation. It was a world away from the frantic energy of the student festival. And Jared felt different within it. He was not an imposter, he was not a ghost, he was the composer. He wore a suit that felt comfortable, not like a costume, and he moved through the room with a quiet confidence that was entirely new to him. The ambient noise was no longer a source of anxiety, but a kind of overture to the main event. When the lights dimmed and the film began, he felt a calm sense of anticipation. And then he heard it, his own music, now magnified by a full orchestra, filling the state-of-the-art theater with a sound so rich and immersive, it was a physical presence. The lonely cello theme he had written for Lena's film had been transformed, evolving into a sweeping, soaring motif for the turn's impossible journey. He felt the deep, resonant vibration of the subwoofers through the floor, a physical manifestation of his own creation. It was the culmination of months of relentless, focused work, and it was, he knew with a deep, bone-deep certainty, the best work of his life. When the final credits rolled, the applause was a thunderous, sustained roar. In the reception that followed, a blur of faces and voices, people approached him. Critics, producers, fellow musicians. He heard his work discussed with a professional, serious admiration that was deeply satisfying. Words like breathtaking, a narrative force, and an unforgettable sonic journey floated around him. He accepted the praise not with the shocked disbelief of his last success, but with a simple, quiet grace. Amid the noise and the congratulations, he noticed a young man standing alone by the wall, clutching a drink with a familiar, terrified expression. He recognized it instantly. It was the look of the imposter. It was the look he himself had worn just a few short months ago. Jared made his way through the crowd. "First premiere?" he asked, his voice gentle. The young man, a student composer who'd had an internship on the film's sound mixing team, jumped, startled. "Is it that obvious?" he stammered, his voice a torrent of nervous energy. "I just feel like I don't belong here. Everyone is so important, and I haven't done anything yet." Jared listened, a profound sense of empathy washing over him. He didn't offer grand pronouncements about the industry. He didn't give a speech. He just offered the simple truth he had learned. "Your voice matters," he said, the words echoing with the memory of Mrs. Gable's kindness, "even when you're the only one who can hear it. Just keep listening to it, and don't be afraid to be heard." He saw a flicker of something in the student's eyes, not a solution, but a spark of hope. Jared gave him a small, encouraging nod and walked away. In that small, quiet moment of connection, he understood. His journey was no longer just about his own survival or his own success. The purpose of being heard was so that you, in turn, could hear others. He had come full circle. A few weeks after the premiere, the buzz had faded. The frantic energy of the release had settled, and life had found its new, peaceful cadence. Jared was in his apartment, which now felt not like a temporary shelter, but a sanctuary. It was a quiet afternoon, and the gentle sound of rain was tapping a soft, percussive rhythm against his window. He sat for a long time, just listening. He reflected on the impossible journey of the past year. He was not a world-famous celebrity. He was a respected working professional. He had his small, quiet studio. He had financial stability, a concept that still felt like a fragile miracle. He had mended the most broken bridges in his life. He had a community, Lena, Mrs. Gable, his new professional colleagues. He understood now that this was the true meaning of success. It wasn't a single, explosive moment of triumph. It was this: a sustained, peaceful rhythm of a purposeful life, a quiet joy that was not dependent on applause. He walked over to his piano. There was no deadline, there was no director's brief, there was no external expectation. He placed his hands on the keys, the smooth, weighted feel of them now as familiar as his own breathing. He simply began to play. A new piece began to form under his fingers. It was not a composition born of pain and desperation like For the Unheard. It was a melody that felt like the gentle, cleansing rain outside his window. It was a piece filled with light, with quiet strength, with the profound, resonant gratitude of a soul that had found its way home. He was creating not because he had to, but simply because he could. Later, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The first major royalty statement from the documentary had arrived. The number on the screen was still surreal, a figure that belonged to someone else's life. He thought of the terrified young composer he used to be, the one who bought a new shirt with his grocery money. He thought of the student at the premiere, filled with so much talent and so much fear. He began to work on something new, not music, a website. With a sense of quiet, firm purpose, he typed the words across the top of the blank page, "The unheard note grant." He began to lay out the framework for a small foundation, funded by a significant portion of his own earnings. Its mission would be simple: to provide emergency financial assistance to struggling student composers in the city, to help them pay the rent, or buy a piece of equipment, or simply afford the breathing room to create without the crushing weight of destitution. The story, and the story of his music, was no longer just about him. Its purpose was to make sure other unheard voices had a chance to play their note. The gentle tapping of the rain continued. He stopped typing and just listened to the sound, a soft and steady rhythm of renewal. He was no longer just a composer of notes. His life itself had become a composition, one that had moved through a painful minor key overture into a complex, resilient, and hopeful symphony. He was finally living inside his own music, and its final, quiet note was one of selfless, enduring grace. Thank you for joining Jared on his journey from silence to symphony. It's a reminder that even in our quietest, most desperate moments, a single, honest note of hope can change everything. Your own voice matters, and the world is waiting to hear your music. Until next time, keep listening.